Watcha! Hello everyone, my name is Felix and I'm here today to talk to you about London. Now some of you will have seen about London in your junior high school textbooks, so maybe you're interested in going there one day. Well, hopefully I can give you a bit more interesting detail about London and about what it's like as a city. So what am I going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk a bit about the geography of London, then we'll talk a bit about who lives there, and then I'm going to use some of those famous sites that you already know and hopefully go into a bit more detail to give you an idea of what London's like in terms of its identity and its history. So let's get started. On the slide with the map, you can see that London, in the same way that Tokyo is divided into wards, is divided into different districts. And for London, we call these districts boroughs. Now, one of the things you need to learn about London straight away is that there are lots of little quirky differences in the way things work, because it's been around so long. So there's lots of little traditional things that have just been kept in over time. And one of them is here. Now, technically, there are 33 districts in London, so there should be 33 boroughs. But number 4, the City of London, is actually a city in its own right. It's a square mile. Roughly a mile is an old measure of distance. And it's where all the financial stuff is in London. But for historical reasons, technically it's its own city. So London really has 32 boroughs and another city in it. But there's 33 different districts. So the first thing to notice, as I'm sure you did, is that there's one clear divide in London. And that's the River Thames. And the River Thames is so important to the way London works. And one of the key ways is the way that London is divided. As you can see, it's only Richmond, right in the far west, in the far left of your screen, that the river actually goes through. The rest of the boroughs, the river only cuts through as the border or the boundary between them. So whenever we talk about London and where you are or where you're from, the first thing you talk about is whether you are north of the river or south of the river. The other key difference, as I'm sure you noticed, is that there are blue and the green ones on the map, and that is the difference between central London and outer London. The other thing to notice is that while it's divided up into different areas for this purpose, there is another way that it's divided up, and that is postcodes. You may know it as zip codes like they use in the US. And in England, unlike Japan or the US, we have letters in our zip codes. I'm from Reading, for example, and Reading is the biggest town in the area. So the letters that we use for all our postcodes are RG. But London is so big that doesn't really work. So they use the compass point letters, like north, N for north, S for south, etc. There's some they can't use. They can't use NE for northeast because there's a big city up in the north of England called Newcastle, where it's already taken. EC and WC stand for East and West Central. So they're the central areas in the inside of the map that you can see. So that's the geography of London, with the Thames being the most important. I also pointed out that Greenwich is on there. Greenwich is useful for time. Greenwich was the first place where they decided where the official time would be and that the rest of the world would work from. But who lives in London? Well, London is a very big city, and it might not seem so big for someone, for example, from Tokyo, but in terms of Europe, it's very big. It's the third biggest city in Europe, and it's got 9 million people. Now, there's only 4 cities in the whole continent with over 5 million, and London's almost twice that. And the other thing is that the other 3 of those are all in the Far East, in Russia or Turkey. So it's the biggest city west of Istanbul. So therefore, for the whole of the west side of Europe, it's a very important focus point. Interestingly, though, it's only just got back up to these levels in recent times, in the last 5 or 10 years. It actually had a very big population before the Second World War, but as London was damaged a lot during the war, during the Blitz, as we called it, when the German Air Force bombed London, lots of people left because, a lot of buildings were ruined. And actually what happened was, over the years, people from Britain were leaving, but people from other countries were coming into London. So now that the population has reached back up to its record level, we actually have a very diverse city. Now, there are other places in the UK that are diverse, but there's nowhere really like London because of its size. So there's so many people from so many different countries. In fact, at the moment, over a third of the people who live in London were born outside of the UK, so abroad. And they think that within 10 years, over half the people in London will be from a different country. And actually, at the moment, there are boroughs already where the population is over half. And I've listed a number of the countries there that you can see. And there's significant populations in all of them and from many other countries. But the main three that I will highlight is India, Poland and Ireland. And the reason I say these is because they have over 100,000 people from those countries who live in London. Now, London has a very big influence on the UK, and one of the reasons for this is its size, how big it is. Normally, in a country, on average, the biggest city in that country is twice the size of the next biggest city. So in the UK, for example, this is very different. The second biggest city in the UK is called Birmingham, and there's only 1 million people who live there. So London is 9 times bigger than any other place in the UK. So therefore it has a lot of influence on the culture in the UK. But also is very different from many other places because there's no other city like it. So that's who lives there. That's who lives there. It's a big city and it's very diverse. But what is London famous for? Well, I'm sure you know a few of those things. So we're going to look at some of the sites and see if we can learn a bit more about what makes London tick. Now, these first ones you'll know very well, and I'm only going to go over them briefly, but I've put a bit more information in the presentation. The reason I want to raise these is because, as you maybe know with Mount Fuji, it's important for a big city or a country to have symbols that people recognise. So the most famous symbol, for example, is Big Ben. Now, Big Ben is very useful because in things like films, it can be used to instantly signify London. Everyone knows Big Ben. And these symbols become part of the identity of the city because they're what a lot of people who come from other countries to see London know. So Big Ben, for example. Often, watch out for it in films. You'll see it in James Bond, for example. They'll use it often. But the London Eye has also become a part of this idea of symbols. And it's interesting because it's very new. It was only built 20 years ago. And it's quite funny now with all our technology and our smartphones and stuff. But because computers and the internet were only in their infancy back in these days, the millennium, the year 2000, was seen as a very big deal. So it was interesting, and we felt like we needed to mark it. Now, the London Eye is useful as well if you ever go to London because it's very central. So you can get a good view from up high of a lot of famous places, which I like to do when I go to cities. Now, you might not know it to look at, but one of the biggest draws for tourists to the UK is the Queen. And Buckingham Palace is the residence in London of the King or Queen. Now, what's very interesting is that the King or Queen doesn't have any power in England anymore. But because of the way that the economy works, tourism is very important to London. And perhaps the biggest draw for people from other countries is the Queen. And so Buckingham Palace is very popular. Okay, but what about some famous places that can tell us a bit more about London as a city? Well, the first one I'm going to talk about is St Paul's Cathedral, which maybe you've seen a picture of. It's got a very famous dome. And there are some things that are important about St Paul's that are the same as things that are important about London. So it's a useful example. It's very old. It was founded in 604. And London is very proud of its history, of how long it's been around. It was founded by the Romans. So we're talking a very, very long time ago. The other thing is that the famous cathedral we see now wasn't built until over 1,000 years later. And it shows the way that London had to go through a lot of adversity and dark times over the centuries. The first permanent real structure that stood for a long time was built in the 1000s. And then King Henry VIII wanted to change the country from Catholic to Protestant, which was a big deal at the time. He wanted to marry a different lady. And he basically started his own church and took a lot of the church's wealth and its gold, and he destroyed a lot of churches. And that happened to St Paul's. Then there was a civil war, and then there was the Great Fire of London in 1666, where it really got damaged. So the new cathedral that you see, the famous cathedral you see here, was built by Britain's most famous architect after the Great Fire of London. So Christopher Wren is his name, and he built this famous dome. And after that, it still continued to have a big influence in the culture in London. It was bombed in the Second World War. It was seen as a symbol of London. But afterwards, it's seen royal weddings. It's seen ceremonies to do with the royal family. It's seen memorial services. And it's seen many famous people, including Martin Luther King and the Dalai Lama, address it. And there's also a lot of famous people who are buried there, like Admiral Nelson, who fought Napoleon, and the poet John Donne. And this is useful to know because it gives you a sense of how something that's in the centre of the community, like a church, can be there for so long and can therefore gather so much history and host famous people and famous events like the royal weddings. But there's other things about St Paul's that are also famous, and I think this shows us something else about London, which is that we like interesting details and things that are a bit quirky. So, for example, in St Paul's, there's a very famous dome, like I said, and there's a walkway you can go around on the inside, but it's not quite perfectly circular. And while this may not seem particularly important, it gave rise to a very interesting event. Because there's lots of little angles, you can whisper along the wall, and because of the way the sound travels, someone who's on the other side of the walkway, the big circle, can hear you very clearly. And so here we can see that we like our history, but we also like things that are more interesting and scientific in a sense that you wouldn't expect. The other thing about St Paul's is that it has protected views. So, for example, in Richmond Park, which is a whole 10 miles away, there's a view line of sight which cannot be blocked. You're not allowed to build anything in it. There's a few other places like St Paul's where it's like that. There are protected lines of sight. And I think this shows you that symbols of London, like St Paul's, are very important to people, and they want to be able to see them, as well as being useful in terms of getting around the city and knowing where you are. But the other place I'd like to talk to you about is the Tower of London, because this encapsulates a lot of London's history and how things developed and how important it is. So it's now a historical royal palace, but actually it's been many things over time. It was built in the 1070s by William the Conqueror, who was the Norman invader. This is a region in France called Normandy. They're not all called Norman. And it's important because in British history, 1066, when William invaded, is the key year in terms of the modern age starting. That's when a lot of the history textbooks in school start. And he built it to be a big fortress in London to show how strong he was. But it's been many things over time. It's been the Royal Mint, where the coins are made. It's been the Royal Armouries, where all the weapons for the king are kept. It's even been a zoo. And I think this is important to show you that because London's so old, many different things have been used for many different purposes. And it means that these histories are very interesting, they're very colourful, and people like that, they celebrate it. Now, because William built it so strong, kings and queens lived there, but it was also known as the most secure castle in the land and kept very important prisoners. Not so many later on, but even until World War II, in times of trouble, it was still used. But it also means that there's been some dark, dark history in the Tower of London. A king was murdered there, 2 princes were murdered, and perhaps most famously, Anne Boleyn, the wife that Henry wanted to marry and therefore made his own church, was executed. And it's said that her ghost still haunts the tower, along with many others, including, apparently, a bear. But this is important to note because, of course, not all history is lovely. And there's a lot of dark history to do with London, a lot of tragedy, and a lot of bad things that other people did. And it's important, in terms of history, to remember those times as well as the good times. But there's a couple of other things about the Tower of London that are interesting. And one of those is that they have these special guards who guard the tower, called the yeoman warders. They're nicknamed the beef eaters because apparently they used to be able to eat as much beef as they wanted. They were allowed to. And they came along during Henry VII's time, Henry VIII's dad. And Henry VIII wanted to move to a different palace, so he left some there. But today, they're still there, even though they're not really needed. They don't guard the Tower of London in the same way, but they still dress in these amazing uniforms and they give guided tours and they do ceremonies. They ceremonially guard the tower for show, like the ceremony of the keys when they lock the tower at night, something that has been done the same way for nearly 1,000 years. Now, I assure you there's security at the tower, but it won't necessarily be these guys or ladies, even though they have to have been in the army for a long time to be a yeoman warder. Now, this is interesting because it shows that London likes tradition. It likes history. Even though these aren't necessary, it's not needed, it's still important to the people to show their history. Now, there's history like this, but there's also another type, like legends and stories that are important. And you see this in the idea of the ravens. Now, there's a famous legend about the Tower of London and the ravens that live there, that if they ever leave the tower, the ravens ever leave, the tower will fall and the kingdom will fall. Now, King Charles II was told this prophecy, and he decreed that the ravens should be protected, even if it didn't necessarily seem like an obvious link between the ravens and the tower falling. So there must always be 6 ravens at the tower. They actually have a spare one. They have a 7th one in case one flies away. And there's a special yeoman warder, a special beefeater, whose job is solely to look after the ravens and make sure they stay at the tower. And he is called the Raven Master, which is a very cool job title. But this shows that London likes its myths, it likes its stories, as well as its traditional history. And these things are important. They're part of the identity. They're part of what makes London the city it is, as is the case with many other cities. The stories are as important as what really happened to people. Okay, guys, so I just want us to have a quick think about what we've learned about London and its identity. So it likes its tradition and its stories, and it likes its real history. And the river is very important. It's very big, and it's come through a lot of dark times, as well as now being very diverse. But the most important thing, I think, are the stories. And these stories are important because they're what kind of brings us together. And London is beautiful because it's so big and there's so many different people from so many different countries. And it's the stories that can connect us. Anyway, thank you for listening, guys. I will leave it there. And it's cheerio from me. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to know more about London. And thank you for listening. Cheerio.